Good evening, everyone. This is the March 26, 2018 Committee of the Whole meeting of the DeKalb City Council. For those of you who may want to speak to any of the two items that we have on the agenda tonight, we would ask that you do get a speaker request form in the back and give that speaker request form to our city clerk, Sue Herman. We'll also have the opportunity on tonight's city council, during which we will have a number of items, and we would welcome public participation during that time. So, roll call, please.
Jacobson?
Here.
Finucane?
Here.
Marquardt?
Here.
Fagan?
Here.
Noriko?
Here.
Burbick?
Here.
Favor?
Here.
Smith?
Here.
8 present.
Our first consideration during tonight's Committee of the Whole meeting is the Greek Housing Fire Safety Act. I'd like to ask our Fire Chief, Eric Hicks, to speak to this item. Eric?
Good evening, Mayor, Council, staff, and residents. I'm here to make a presentation tonight on the Greek Housing Fire Safety Act, or GHFSA for short. I'm going to talk a little bit about the progression of the Act. And the Act started in 2005 when the state enacted the Illinois Fire Sprinkler Dormitory Act, which required all Illinois fire dormitories to be fully sprinklered by January 1st of 2013. As part of the spin-off of that act, they realized they missed a few different structures, and those are the Greek structures that are kind of like dormitories. So they added on the act of all college Greek housing would be sprinklered by January 1st of 2019. As an addition to that act, they had all housing as of January 1st, 2011 that's being new constructed to have sprinklers installed at time of construction. Kind of the Act, in a broad definition, is the Act defines any structure with members of a fraternity or sorority residing in it, the organization that is tax exempt and whose membership is predominantly college students, and the structure may also provide for other activities in addition to housing, such as common meeting areas and party room type facilities. As you can see, this Act is very broad. A little bit about past actions. Back in May 29th of 2012, an executive summary was presented to the council at that time, talking about the act and informing them. And then it came to the COW September 10th of 2012. At that time, the council decided not to take any action and to wait and see if the act had been changed or rescinded. That act did not get changed or rescinded, so this is where we're at today. Annually, since 2012, it's been presented at the annual fraternity and sorority life meetings, and it's been discussed with different owners and managers at time of annual rooming house inspections. So to get started here, we had to get some questions answered from the Office of State Fire Marshal, or OFSM. So we asked the State Fire Marshal, will they issue in a letter explaining their view on home rule? And basically, the answer we got back from the State Fire Marshal was they would not answer home rule. So question number 2, where a building is occupied partially for Greek housing and partially for other uses, does the Office of State Fire Marshal have guidance on how they interpret the act? So what if only one unit in a multi-unit building is being used for Greek housing? That was a question we had. Is it their interpretation that the act applies to a structure with members of a fraternity or sorority living within an act? And then, with the purpose of Greek housing be related to fraternity sorority use. So they came back with the opinion that an entire building mixed with Greek housing and private residence should be considered Greek housing and should be fully sprinklered. Question number 3, how many members need to reside together in an occupancy to constitute Greek housing? The State Fire Marshal came back and said they do not stipulate a number of Greek occupants, so they leave that up to us. What is the State Fire Marshal's opinion about an entire building occupied as a fraternal organization with each member residing under separate leases. It was thought early on that you could get around the act by renting the building out under separate leases. So they came back and said, buildings with Greek members housed under separate leases shall be sprinklered and shall be considered Greek housing. So next, we evaluated all the different Greek structures throughout the city. 28 properties were identified as either current or past Greek residential properties. Out of those 28 properties, 22 are currently occupied by the Greek community. So that leaves 6 that are not currently occupied by the Greek community and are currently rented out as rooming houses. But I believe it's important to note these structures in order if they want to be reoccupied by the Greek community again. One of those 6 is currently sprinklered, so the other 5 would have to be sprinkled if they're currently reoccupied. So I talked about the 22 properties that we've identified that are current Greek properties today. 7 of those properties are fully sprinklered, so they've got their the obligation met. 1 apartment building is partially sprinklered, and that would leave 15 properties that are going to need to be partially sprinklered or fully sprinklered by January 1st of 2019. This map here depicts the different ownership, where the water mains are, and then the different what's sprinklered and what's not. And I'll talk about the water mains when we get down a little farther, but it's very important to look at this map and kind of see what's out there. I'm going to talk about the project considerations. So the system's divided, this is divided into 2 different systems. One would be the sprinkler system and the infrastructure. So number 1, we're going to need to retrofit each building with a fire suppression system. I put this diagram of a sprinkler system up here so everybody knows what a sprinkler system is and what the infrastructure is. So if you look at the underground fire line, that is the infrastructure. That goes up to the first valve. The installation by that is done by an underground, like an excavator and a sprinkler or a plumber, and then they would go to the first valve. Everything after the first valve in the building is done by the sprinkler contractor. This also shows the monitoring system that would be needed. Many of our buildings that we've identified currently do have a compliant alarm system. There are going to be a few that need to be upgraded. So I wanted you to see the whole system in its entirety, and then just so you know exactly what we're talking about in sprinkler system and infrastructure. So the second phase would be the infrastructure itself. So we went through and we evaluated every different water service on the buildings that are not sprinkled. The current 7 that are sprinkled have had upgraded water services added to the building, but the 15 that are not sprinkled are going to need a 2 to 3 inch service added to the building from the water main. So we just want to add that into the cost and let people know what's going to have happen. Also, as part of the infrastructure, we believe Chapter 5 talks about fire hydrants with sprinkler systems, which requires a fire hydrant within 30 to 50 feet of between every sprinkler system connection. We believe that is overkill, and there's no need to add 15 more hydrants in that area, so we're recommending leaving the hydrants as is on each corner. Would reduce cost. Now I'm going to talk about what other communities have done. And these are all Illinois university communities. And I'm going to tell you what they've done and how they are enforcing the act. So SIU in Carbondale is enforcing the act. Currently, they have sent notification to off-campus properties with their intent to enforce the act in the compliant state. Champaign, Illinois, U of I, they have the Premier Act within the state. They've made their own ordinance that requires every rooming house to be fully sprinklered with 16 or more occupants. So they went way above what the act would require. So they did not even differentiate Greek or rooming house. They just went all in on rooming houses. Next would be Charleston at EIU. They are enforcing the act, and they've also sent a recent notice to off-campus properties, so of the compliant state. So they're in about the same boat we are. Evanston, they're a private university, and through local ordinance, they required all Greek facilities to be fully sprinklered, and they did so in 2009. So they have 29 current sprinkler facilities. Macomb and Western, They are working on a local ordinance, and they are expecting all of their off-campus properties to be fully sprinklered by 2019. Macomb defined a Greek house is determined by a building that's registered with the city and displaying Greek letters on the property. And Normal is about the same. They're enforcing the act also. Sent a recent letter out to the properties not in compliance, and they also define a Greek house is one that's registered and displaying Greek houses on the building. Talk about the financial impact on this. We realize it's expensive. We're looking somewhere between $50,000 and $80,000 for some of our larger structures, and that would include the system and the water supply. An additional possible $15,000 to $30,000 for an upgraded fire alarm system if you have not kept your alarm system upgraded. Like I say, a lot of people do have a current system that will support a sprinkler system, so they would not need a new alarm system. So in all, about $1.2 million to do all 15 organizations. So we've got some questions for council. So we need to know, is there a consensus to support the act? I mean, that's one of our first questions. Our second one would be, we need to define what a Greek structure is. So some of our possible considerations are a Greek organization with university affiliation, current historical Greek occupation of a structure, physical identification, such as Greek letters on the house, city-defined Greek-owned rooming houses, plus we also, those that are do have a registered those are registered with the university and supply and then have events through the university. And also apartment buildings with multiple Greek residents living under individual leases. That's another question we'll need to answer. So basically, I'm going to let Joellen talk about this slide for a minute.
Thank you. Eric and I are tag teaming this a little bit. So moving forward with this project, I know one of the very initial questions that was asked is, would there be any type of financial assistance available to the owners of all of the buildings that were not yet sprinkled? It's been out there for a while, and obviously, you know, we kind of went back and forth a little bit trying to tear that apart a little bit and understand how that would make the people feel that have already paid for. You know, there was 7 property owners that went through the process and made those investments on their own without any financial assistance. On the other hand, we do have 15 structures in an area of town that we know is very vulnerable right now, and we want to make sure it stays stabilized. And that the Greek organizations are a very important part of that neighborhood. So we felt it very important that we do offer something. If somebody really doesn't have access to credit or the type of financing that would be necessary to make sure Greek housing stays in that neighborhood, let's see what we can come up with. So the water fund itself was identified as a potential resource for tapping into and coming up with some type of a financial assistance package. We did talk about what types of financial assistance might be available. So for example, one alternative that was thrown out is, can we help provide for the infrastructure? So what Eric described is that part that goes from the main in the street, from the water main in the street, underground into the building. We talked about that, but in all other instances in private development, the city never pays for that. That's not, we call it infrastructure, like we refer to infrastructure in the street, but that's really the private side infrastructure. So we decided that might not be a good precedent to start for that private investment. We also wanted to be cognizant of the fact that since we're using the city's water fund, we want to protect that. That water fund is there to be available if the city needs it to improve our infrastructure. In talking with Finance Director Molly Talkington, we have about $1.5 million that we could access for some type of an assistance, and we felt it would be reasonable to make that available as a loan to people who might, again, not otherwise have access to credit or capital. That loan could be set up with a term and a repayment schedule that we can determine. But again, understanding that we're trying to protect the city's water capital fund, our idea was to place it at a little bit less than attractive if somebody went to a bank to get financing for this type of an improvement. We could secure that loan by setting up a special service area. This is a tool I think most of the council is familiar with. What's a little bit different in this, I think, from others that you might have set up is that we've determined, Attorney Frieders has determined that we can set it up so that only those properties that are getting the loan would need to be part of the special service area. So if they're getting the loan, the agreement that we have with them would need to stipulate that they can't object to the special service area. The terms of that would then show up on their property tax bill, and they would repay the loan over whatever term is set through when they pay taxes. So again, this is up for consideration. This is meant to be a discussion item, so this was something we thought sounded like a reasonable alternative. We can certainly talk about other options. Again, our main goal was to try and protect the city's water fund and still provide assistance to those who needed it the most. The other policy considerations are just kind of what I described, and that is, does the council support the use of the water fund backed up by an SSA for up to $1.2 million? So that 1.2 assumes an estimated average cost of $80,000 for all 15 of those units. So Eric threw out a few other numbers, 22, and I think our recommendation at this point is to just follow the Greeks. Let's take the 15 that we know they're either going to be where they are right now, or they're going to be making plans to locate to another area, so we can communicate with them and find out what their plans are. We also need to initiate dialogue with the property owners as well, so that we make sure that wherever they do end up, that we're communicating both the requirements and the opportunities that are being presented to them. Some of the other terms that we thought about are also in here for your consideration. Do you want to set a loan to value? So if we do a loan, we could loan the full amount of whatever it is, or you could say we'll loan you 80%. So that's another option that we threw out there for your consideration. And then also, should we only make this available to the 15 that we're going after? And I think until we kind of go through one cycle of it and see what falls out, because quite honestly, I think a few might fall off and we'll figure something strange has happened and we need to address that again next year. I'd hate to try and anticipate what that scenario might be, so I think it would be better just to do what we can, try our best to comply with the act, get those done, and then if we need to follow up again next year, we can do that. By the way, if we do go forward with any type of a new amount from the water fund, that would require a budget amendment, and we would bring that forward to you for further consideration. So that concludes our presentation. I can back up to the questions if you like, or you can open it up for discussion.
Well, as is the case with most of our items, what I'd like to do is to get some feedback from members of the public, and then we'll turn it over to discussion by the city council. I have one person from the audience who would like to speak to this item. If you are another person, please give that form, your speaker request form, to our city clerk, Sue Herman. Dave Jacobson, a familiar face. Dave, you might explain why you're sitting in the audience and not up here, and you're more than welcome to speak to this item. Dave?
Dave Jacobson, First Ward. I am sitting in the audience because I have recused myself from at least the behind-the-scenes discussion and formulation of this. This is the first time I've actually seen the entirety of the plan rolled out. I've seen some portions in other public meetings with the university, but I own a fraternity house on Greek Row. I own one of those 15 unsprinkled buildings, which gives me sort of a unique perspective on what's going on out there. But in terms of full public disclosure and relieving the conflict, obviously I am not sitting up in the full debate with the council this evening. In terms of, again, having that unique view of what's going on and what's happening out on Greek Row, I appreciate that the law has been on the books now for 8 years. There have been many conversations held between owners and housing cores both locally and statewide on some of these changes. I think it is imperative for the council to define what a Greek housing structure is going to be for a very simple reason. Someone like me would be a perfect example. I live in an apartment on Greek Row. Under the strictest interpretation of the ordinance, that apartment building owner would have to sprinkle my unit because I am an advisor in a fraternity and wear Greek letters. That's foolish, obviously. There are things the council can do to certainly ensure a very clear and black and white definition of what the expectations are going to be for those property owners is going to be. I think significant effort is going to have to be made to protect several of our multicultural fraternities specifically that are much more transient in nature, where many of the IFC and CPC or CPA, whatever their council, the sorority is called, PHA, thank you, is now referring themselves as, they have standard brick and mortar houses that you would equate as fraternity houses with Greek letters on them. Many of our smaller organizations and multicultural organizations are somewhat more transient. They move between buildings every year or two or a couple years. They have smaller structures. They don't necessarily have Greek letters on them. But again, under this act, they would be considered Greek housing structures merely because members of an organization live within that building. So I think there's going to have to be a significant amount of time and effort put into the actual definition of our local policy. I know there are several local experts, one of them is in the room, that can certainly help define what a Greek housing structure could and should be in terms of the reality of the act as a whole. Again, having somewhat of a conflict of interest, it's frustrating. Well, I appreciate the fact that the city has at least come up with some plan in terms of a loan. I don't feel we should be acting as a loan shark in this situation. It is an unfunded mandate that the state has put upon these owners in a certainty on our campus especially of some very odd things that are going on Greek Row, where value is being questioned in some of these buildings, where the university is taking a very different perspective in terms of how they handle Greeks, and in a neighborhood that we know is high risk to begin with. I want to make sure that the city is cognizant of those things and making their decisions. I want to make sure that we are not accidentally continuing to blight the neighborhood, understanding that the reality is if the owners are unable or unwilling to do these projects, that the buildings will likely become very high call volume properties. In terms of the buildings themselves, they are 50 to 70 years old in some cases, were built in a very different time, and generally would attract a much more, looking for the word here, transient tenant that would not be ideal, certainly for the neighborhood or the stability of the neighborhood. In looking at some of the things we can do, while I appreciate again that we've come up with some small answer right here, basically at the last minute of whether or not we're going to be able to do these things, I think we need to get an understanding as a city quickly within the next week or two of what the owners plan on doing, how many of the owners plan on doing these things. To not have that knowledge or understanding, while we've tried to reach out, I think we need to make a stronger effort in doing that to firm out those 15 properties of what the plan and what the ownership plan to do with them. In terms of what else we can do as a city, there are other things that I certainly can probably suggest that would be low impact or no impact, in terms of waiving tap fees and waiving permit fees, something that we do very often in economic development. And while I appreciate that these properties are already built and already existing, the reality is there are, in those 15 properties, 500 to 600 bodies in that neighborhood that are the economic engine of that neighborhood. They are the least transient of the tenants in that neighborhood. They are the tenants that have been in those buildings for 15 or 20 years, and to lose them would be devastating for the very hyper-local economy we have in that neighborhood. Beyond those easy and quick fixes that I think will certainly be council decisions, I think we also have to consider, or you all have to consider, whether or not using something like the water fund, which is meant for both economic development projects and emergencies, If this declares as either of those, and you believe that it is an economic development goal to keep the Greeks in the neighborhood, or if it is an emergency, being that it's an unfunded mandate, and we're down to the last 6 months of the wire here, knowing those contractors have to be hired in a very few, probably 45 to 60 days to get those projects underway. Again, if that is indeed the case, we do have funds available for these projects, realizing that none of the buildings have adequate infrastructure that generally I would assume would be city-provided infrastructure. When you turn the spigot on in your house, you expect the city to supply the water. I would understand, both as an owner in the neighborhood and a tenant, that I would expect the same. Well, I understand that the sprinkler projects internally specifically are going to fall squarely on the owner's shoulders. Some of the infrastructure in the neighborhood that is certainly dated in terms of, again, 50 to 70-year-old properties can be a city project. It would fall into the constructs of what we do into the water fund and would be an available project that would be significantly less than what we're seeing today. I don't know if it's been costed yet just for that infrastructure or not, again, being part of the sideline of it. So I appreciate the conversation, and I will certainly intently be listening on what some of those thoughts are. And if you would like to contact me wearing my resident hat, you are all more than welcome to do so to get more basis and understanding in the neighborhood. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I think you raised some good points. We have one other speaker who has registered to speak to this item. The idea of asking or determining just how many of those 15 are really going to go ahead with this project or are interested in proceeding, I think is important too. But before we turn that over to any other comments, Glenn Roby, I think you'd like to speak to this item, correct?
Thank you. I'd like to thank everyone for the opportunity to speak today. I've had the pleasure of working with both Joel and Eric on a lot of things leading up to the discussion today. I feel very positive about some of the ideas that are coming forward from the city. My concerns, and I will just shorten my comments, I will echo Alderman Jacobson, or Citizen Jacobson's comments as it relates to this. So I embrace all of those, and then we'll just add my few to the mix. If there was the last slide that you had up here, and I don't know if there were, I was making notes, so I didn't know if you commented on the extension. That is an option if someone is contracted for the work, and not because it would happen right in the middle of the school year. So if you have tenants that are in a building and the building is intended to be sprinkled and the work isn't done by January 1, having an extension at least through the end of the next school year would probably be something that I think the city should consider to allow those people that have full intent on meeting this law. My other concern is with the number. I know that it was University of Illinois used a number of 16. We have had, just in my experience, a migration to other areas of the city in rooming houses where that number would be 10 to 7 residents living there that would identify themselves as Greek. And then you basically would have a shift from that neighborhood to those smaller structures. They would then set up potentially as the new home base and then avoid having to sprinkle those buildings and thus forcing exodus from that neighborhood into other neighborhoods. And the neighborhood one in particular I know is a neighborhood that I think has been targeted for revitalization and kind of converting those rooming houses back to single family homes. At least that's been some discussion. So that would impact that neighborhood and the makeup of that neighborhood if there was that move. So a number that would, and I think it's 4 to 5 unrelated people living in an apartment throughout the city is kind of what's an accepted practice. So maybe a number closer to that to require the sprinkler would maybe be a better number than 16, just a thought. And just be mindful that, I know I certainly have a vested interest in this community. I own a property there and I oversee several others, and really wanted to try to stabilize that neighborhood and create a neighborhood that is both, desirable for students and families, and a good blend when we're working with the Annie Glidden North Task Force to try to accomplish that. And this would be a huge hit if people are not able to make this thing happen by January 1. So just please consider all things in trying to bring about a more stabilized neighborhood. And certainly this requirement is a difficult one financially for a lot of the people that own property in that neighborhood, and could cause a mass exodus or a lack of investment in that area. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. Yeah, we certainly do have some challenges ahead of us now. Joe Ellen and Eric, if you'd stay there, I'd like to open it up to any comments or questions for City Council. Alderman Fagan. Did you have a final?
Mayor, if I could, there was one more question we did have for the council that we did miss at the end, and that was, should there be an extension for those that have started the project and are unable to complete by January 1st of 2019?
Right, okay. Alderman Fagan.
Joellen, what have other towns done for financial assistance, if they have done financial assistance?
I don't think there was any financial assistance provided in the other communities that we called. Right?
Most of these communities have sent a letter out and expect the work done by January 1st of 2019.
Okay. Eric, what's our liability if we don't comply fully?
Well, the state fire marshal has opined that they will take the fire department certification away, and they are the person that oversees the fire department and our grants and things like that. And also, I believe there's huge liability within the city when every other college town in the state has done this, and then we decide we don't want to do it. So I think the city would have some liability on it, but I will let Attorney Frieders weigh in on that.
In terms of trying to ascertain what our liability would be for not enforcing or for having a different standard than other communities, I think that would be somewhat analogous to the varying standards that different municipalities have for other aspects of their fire prevention code. There are some municipalities that require sprinklers in single-family residences. There are some municipalities that require sprinklers in different types of structures that we do not currently. It's clear from the legislative record that the state perceived that there was a greater risk of fire death in Greek housing, and NFPA documentation on types of fires at different types of structures seemed to suggest that there is a greater occurrence of fires, including fires involving the loss of life at dormitory type structures. It'd be difficult to put a good analysis on exactly what our potential liability would be, but again, there are many areas where we have different standards in other communities. Other communities have standards that are more or less stringent on fire safety related items. So I don't know that would necessarily be at the front of the principles that should be governing the council's decision here.
Well, the reason why I ask that is that, if the state is mandating this, otherwise, it's just like anything else. If the state says you have to do something and you don't want to do it, then they can take away funds from us, right?
Correct.
And they could, or they would.
They could. It was something they would have to decide if they want to do with the fire department itself.
Yeah. And I guess, Joellen, with the SSAs, I don't know how you would go over and have one building maybe that's 15,000 square feet, another building that's 10,000 square feet, and figure out an SSA on that. Is that feasible?
If I can jump in on that one. Special service areas by law can be established either on an ad valorem basis where you're basing the levy off of the property tax, or they can be established on a pro rata basis where you are defining a specific dollar number that would be levied.
Right.
There are communities that have funded public and public-private utility improvements by using an SSA levied on a pro rata basis, essentially as a lease payment or a repayment of a loan. So that has been done before.
Okay.
Alderman Fanouken.
Eric, if a property owner decides not to comply, what are his or her consequences with the state, or is that completely up to the city?
Right now, it's up to the city, but the state, we could involve the state fire marshal.
Okay.
If I can jump in on that just briefly as well, the analog that we have for this comes from a couple of years back when the state adopted more stringent standards with regard to elevator inspection and certification. Going back to 2011, 2012 timeframe, the city used to inspect elevators ourselves. When the state fire marshal adopted more stringent standards, they took the position that those standards were enforceable statewide, even against home rule municipalities, despite the absence of any language in the state act that said this is the limit on home rule. When we inquired with the fire marshal at that point in time, their response was, this is applicable statewide. We have the unilateral ability to go after property owners that don't comply regardless of what your local ordinances are. And if a local municipality doesn't comply with these standards, we have the right to decertify a local fire department and indicate that you're essentially no longer recognized by the state as a fire suppression agency. With regard to elevators, the state had a two-track system where you could either locally enforce the ordinance and conduct inspections yourself, or you could get out of that business and say, we are no longer inspecting them, and the fire marshal took over that process. That is ultimately what the city did with regard to the elevators. In this case, their responses have been very analogous, that if you don't follow the act, that they could decertify your fire department, but they have not yet talked about having any separate independent prosecution of violations, although in theory it is possible.
Alderman Noriko.
I have a question about the construction of the system. Would it be possible to have it done in phases? In other words, the basic infrastructure, and then as a property owner is arranging additional financing, then the actual, work that has to be done in the building could be done then?
It's usually installed in two phases by two different contractors. So the contractor will put in the underground, and then the sprinkler contractor would make the inside install of the actual sprinkler system. So it could be installed in two phases, but normally the project is done all at one time. You have an outside contractor laying the underground, and then you have an inside contractor hanging the inside sprinkler pipe.
And how long does it take to do the work? Because, I'm looking at the issue of an extension. Well, people have had years to do this and, plan it and so forth. And then, December 15th, they're going to say, we can do it, or, it's delayed.
A good contractor could do it in a few weeks. The big thing is getting someone to come in and design your system. Each system is slightly different. You can't just, I did make an inquiry with a sprinkler contractor the other day and asked him, can we write a generic set of specifications for this? He said, well, you could for different valving and things like that, but you really can't for the entire building, because each building, for example, a building with a 10 by 10 square room with nothing else is going to need one sprinkler head. The building next door to it with a 10 by 30 may need two sprinkler heads or three. So you really can't make a generic specification for each building, but you could do for small sections of that building.
And are the companies that install these, are they readily available, or are there like two in Northern Illinois, or?
There's quite a few companies out there that do it. Some people I know are already in progress with this. I've talked to some of the student advisors, and they say there are people that are getting their bids and getting things lined up to do it right now. So, I think it's kind of first come, first serve, and if you want to do it, you want to get on the project.
Yeah, the crux of the challenge, frankly, is the timing right now. January 2018. Alderman Verbeek.
Yeah, and I'm sympathetic with property owners, but this has been 5 years in the making. And I'm unwilling to make exceptions on safety. So certainly I support yes to number one, and really like the sound of the University of Illinois approach with sprinkling all rooming houses. And the language that they use, I thought, went to safety first.
Alderman Fanouken.
And that brings me up another one. You talked about one of the other communities has given extensions. How has the state fire marshal taken to city giving an extension? Have they reacted to that at all?
They have not reacted on it yet. We're still hoping that people comply by 2019. So we're just trying to plan ahead.
Just to answer the questions, I do believe that we should have this enforced. They should be working on it or have it done by 2019. If we did use a water fund, I really have a hard time that, but if we came to agreement, the most I would give out is 50% on loan to value of the work performed. And I have a question on the extension. I would say yes, give a 6 months extension, but only if it does not come back on recourse to the city.
Alderman Favor.
So I think I would be pretty much in agreement with Alderman Fagan. One of the, I guess, as was mentioned earlier, we do need to come up with what are we going to define as Greek housing, because I honestly don't like the fact that you could have one person, or a couple residents in a apartment building, and then now the entire building has to be sprinkled because of that. If that were the case, I think, you would think there would be then potentially, a question on your lease form. Are you a Greek member? Yes. Well, you are no longer renting in my building, type of thing. So I think we need to define what we're going to do in terms of, I like what the other two groups had done where they had specified, buildings that were identified as Greek organizations, Greek letters on the building. That may not go as well with others.
Yeah, I believe I'm hearing some consensus. I think it is important to identify of those 15 homes, rooming houses, how many have at least initially said, yeah, we're going to do it. We'd like your help, we'd like this, but at least we're going to do it.
We haven't got a good accurate number on that yet. That will be our next step once we decide.
Can we do that rather expeditiously?
Yes, we should be able to.
Okay, good. Alderman Noriko.
In terms of how we're going to identify these organizations, does NIU have any definition that they use, and to what extent do they provide financial support for an organization that they identify as a Greek?
I could not answer on the financial support, but they do have identified organizations. And most of those identified organizations, we get a regular report on when they have events and things like that. So those are the ones we're kind of looking at is the high-profile Greek housings right now.
And it seems to me that would at least be a useful starting point in terms of how we identify a Greek organization, because I agree with Alderman Favor, to follow the absolutely strictest, definition, two people, Greeks in an apartment building, it becomes untenable to police that also.
You're correct. It'll be very hard to manage that. And that's why we're kind of looking at a blend of some of these four to make it manageable and also a good definition.
Alderman Fanouken.
Eric, if I recall correctly from one of our conversations, I think one of the extreme examples we have here in town, that there's a house that's being rented by 3 people and 2 of them are Greeks. And so in the broadest definition, that house should be required to be sprinkled. Is that correct?
That's correct, although they are renting it to private individuals. It's owned by a fraternity member, but the leases go to private individuals.
But as I understood our conversation, at least 2 of those individuals were members of the Greek organization.
Correct, so you're right in that broad definition.
That's, as I said, an extreme example of where this could go should the fire marshal decide to fully press it.
Correct.
Okay. Jerry, if I may continue for a moment, I think that it is important that we meet the deadline. I don't know that I'm comfortable with the extension because we don't know how the fire marshal is going to react. As to potential for a loan backed by an SSA, I'd at least be open to continuing discussion on that.
Well, a lot of moving parts in this, for sure, and we've got to move, again, as I say, relatively quickly. We got to make the right decision for those folks and for the city of DeKalb. So we will move as quickly as we possibly can as a council to answer some of your questions. Fair enough? Okay, thank you, Eric, and thank you, Joellen.
Thank you.
We have one more item on the Committee of the Whole agenda tonight. Alderman Jacobson will rejoin us, and that is Compass, changing outcomes by making parents accountable, supported, and successful. Our Deputy Police Chief, John Petrogallo, will address this item. John?
Good evening, Mayor, Council. Tonight we'll be introducing you to a newly developed program that's been in the works now for a number of months. And as you said, its compass changing outcomes by making parents accountable, supported, and successful. It's an interdisciplinary approach to targeting juvenile recidivism. So we're doing everything we can from what we've seen to try to negate that. The goal of Compass is to provide opportunities and resources to support juveniles and their families in an effort to prevent juvenile criminal behavior. I'll be providing you with the origin of the program, a collaboration that took place with local stakeholders, and the benefits to the program. We also have some of our partners with us this evening that would like to provide you with some comments after I'm finished. In 2016, the city of DeKalb experienced a sharp increase in juvenile crime. Many of these crimes that were committed by a handful of habitual juvenile offenders. Our department command staff began meeting to develop ways to address this problem and trend. In doing so, we looked at specific cases where juvenile offenders progressed into adult criminal court. So we had seen juveniles at age 15 continue the same behavior into their adult life, and is something that we're trying very hard to prevent. In some of these cases, the juveniles had little to no parental guidance to help redirect their behavior. We asked what else could be done to address the juvenile crime early on to prevent future criminal acts that would be a benefit to the juvenile, their parents, the entire family, and the community. We also looked internally to our patrol officers, our school resource officers, our investigators that all play a part in investigating juvenile offenses. They also saw a trend. Some parents lack tools and support to manage their child's behavior, and they also noticed that some refuse to engage with support services and their child to reduce or curb the criminal behavior. Together, command staff with the assistance of City Attorney Dean Frieders created a draft ordinance designed to address this problem. Next, we invited our outside stakeholders to help continue in the development of the program. And after several meetings involving the school district, DeKalb School District, Youth Services Bureau, Juvenile Justice Council, DeKalb County Probation, DeKalb County State's Attorney's Office, 2 Northern Illinois University doctoral students, as well as members from our faith-based community, a rough draft evolved into a collaborative document that all supported, and everyone there thought it would be beneficial to pursue. The vision of this was to engage local stakeholders with the police department and bringing several disciplines together that could offer parents support and resources at one time and at one location. The vision also includes the police department offering and hosting informational educational meetings for parents from a police perspective. Outside stakeholders will assist in program implementation and conduct assessments depending on parental needs. We looked at possible grant opportunities to assist with this endeavor. We saw potential assistance from NIU doctoral students that may help in the development of performance measures to determine whether or not the program was successful and effective. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to City Attorney Dean Frieders for a technical overview of the ordinance.
As Deputy Chief Petrogallo indicated, at the end of 2016, observing the statistics on juvenile crime and recidivism in the community, Chief Flower came to us with a mandate to find a way of successfully addressing this. We studied ordinances literally from across the country, from California to Michigan to New York State, looking at models that had proven effectiveness, that had objective data indicating that they were effective in combating juvenile recidivism or improving the level of support for parents. What we found were programs that had sticks, that had penalties for noncompliance, and we found programs that had carrots, that had educational programs that were designed to provide parental resources and support. We did not find programs that combined those two together and that tried to create a supportive environment for parents while encompassing and including penalties for those that don't go down that path, that don't accept support, or that don't engage and redirect their children's efforts. Chief Lowry gave Deputy Chief Petrogallo direction to carry forward this program and to investigate it. And what we've put together has been, as Deputy Chief Petrogallo indicated, put together with recommendations from all of the different stakeholders that have been a part of this program. It is essentially a 3-step program. The first step being when a juvenile commits an offense in the city of DeKalb, we would reach out to the parents with an informational letter. That letter would, 1, detail to those parents the Illinois Parental Responsibility Act, which is a state statute indicating that you as a parent can be financially responsible for actual damages caused by the actions of a minor child under your care or custody. It would also outline the rest of the program. It would invite you to participate voluntarily in the program, but it would explain stages 2 and 3 and what can happen if you don't take action to reform your children's behavior. The second offense, committed by the same minor or another minor in the same household within a rolling 12-month period, would generate some mandatory involvement for you. So one thing that you would be required to do as a parent or guardian is come in and meet with one of our trained juvenile resource officers. That's something that we as a city have as a resource that we can extend and make available to parents without incurring additional cost, trying to come up with a program that we can bring forward to council and recommend without adding a price tag to it. So you would have a one-on-one meeting with a trained juvenile officer where we would identify the specific behavior that your child is engaged in, any other warning signs associated with that, any other concerns that perhaps we can help you be aware of, strategies for dealing with or preventing recurring of violations. You would also be invited and required to attend a larger group meeting that would likely be conducted at the police station, but that would be guided by some of our social service agency partners. The purpose of that larger group meeting is twofold. 1, getting a group of like-minded parents and guardians into a room where they can share stories and share thoughts and get some information, the support component of this, education on successful parenting strategies, on ways of addressing and dealing with recidivist behavior by the minors under their care or custody. And 2, providing an opportunity for one-on-one interaction between those parent or guardians and the social service agency partners we'd be working with, so that the parents can be made aware of the different support programs that we have in the community, so that they can identify which programs exist that may be a great match for that parent and may provide them with some direct one-on-one counseling or support through an existing program that we have. We would work to align available community resources, again, without additional cost, to the needs of parents that may simply not be aware that those programs are out there. If you're a parent or guardian, you engage in that process, you participate, you attend the meetings, you follow suggestions that may come out of those. Even if there is some recidivism by your minor, as long as you're engaged in a good faith process of working with the city and available resources to try and address the problem, we would continue working with you and continue providing that support. On the other hand, if a parent chooses not to engage, if they don't attend the meeting with the police department, if they don't attend the meeting with social service agencies, if they make no effort to implement any changes in their behavior or any recommendations from the social service agencies, and if there's a third violation in a rolling 12-month period, so a juvenile in their household committing 3 separate violations of the law in 12 months, then there would be the potential for the parent themselves to be directly charged with a parental responsibility violation. In such an action, we would have to prove, 1, that the juvenile engaged in the unlawful act, and 2, that some action of the parent contributed to that, either through their direct actions or their failure to act in the betterment of the children under their care or custody. The draft ordinance that's before you is crafted in such a fashion as to give the court the maximum amount of power to deal with a situation flexibly. That a court, instead of simply looking at this as a matter to be fined, the court could order the parent to undergo counseling. The court could order the parent to participate in a social service agency, to make use of available community resources, to try and do things to positively influence the behavior and have an intervention at a stage when it can be meaningful in a juvenile's early life, rather than seeing the recidivism proceed into more and more severe crimes. in the very early meetings when we talked about this, and we had the command staff, we had Commander Riddell and Commander Lakis and Deputy Chief Petrogallo and Chief Lowry sitting around a table. They can tell you stories about individuals that they dealt with 15 years ago when they were youth, where they had some criminal event occur, some relatively innocuous offense the offender committed. And the officers all said, if we could have intervened at that point, if we could have offered more support, if we could have gotten in touch with the parents, if we could have had a process in place to get them resources in the community, we wouldn't still be dealing with them today. And many of those offenders today are repeat offenders that have been charged with misdemeanors or felonies, or are people that are currently incarcerated. What we're trying to find is a process to break that cycle of recidivism.
This time I'd like to invite Bree Kness from the Juvenile Justice Council to approach the podium and address council.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Bree Kness. I'm the coordinator of DeKalb County's Juvenile Justice Council, and I am here tonight to support DeKalb Police Department in the creation of the Compass program. I hope that we are able to see the implementation of this program simply because DeKalb Police Department have identified a gap in services that currently exist in our community, and that is the support of parents through information and education with the goal of reducing juvenile delinquency and recidivism in the city of DeKalb. Thank you.
I'd like to invite up Diana Hulst from Youth Services Bureau.
Good evening, and thank you for this opportunity to give our support towards this program. The DeKalb County Youth Service Bureau works primarily with adolescents and their families. A number of these youth we've probably already seen in our early risk assessment project or diversion from the courts. We also have experience working with parents who have been court mandated to do active parenting of teens classes through DCFS. So for those parents that do get to that third stage, we have experience working with parents who might not necessarily be willing to come forth. However, we have found that when we can get active parental involvement in a youth services and work with the parent too on their techniques while we're also working with the juvenile themselves, we have a greater chance to see positive outcomes for not only the juvenile but the family as a whole. So we're committed again to make sure that these families are aware of our services, and that if they choose to use our services, to make that process as seamless as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana.
DeKalb County State's Attorney Rick Amato.
Good evening, Mayor. Good evening, Council. Thank you for having me. We, as the State Attorney's Office, support the ordinance. We commend the law enforcement community, especially DeKalb City Police, for working on this, and we've seen it both locally and efforts throughout the state that I've seen, as well as nationwide, that the focus of law enforcement cannot just only be on punishment and punishment alone, arrest after arrest. We need, as law enforcement, from our community police through the state's attorney's office, through our community partners, to work on recidivism. Diversion and diversionary programs is the idea of getting people out of the criminal justice system. But to be able to do that, you need to work on new skills. Access to treatment, access to ways of thinking that they haven't been exposed to previously. And so if we don't enact programs like Compass, and my office there's diversion programs we're working on, there's other programs with the DeKalb City Police we're working on, if we don't work on developing new thought processes and new ways, we're bound to continue in the pattern we're in. And that's why I really support the thoughtfulness of DeKalb City Police in putting together this, as well as Attorney Frieders with coming with this legislation for the council to consider, and we support it fully. It fits in line with where we're at. Divert people out of the criminal justice system. This could have impact, as mentioned, generationally, not just for this group of youth today, but possibly their children and beyond. And that's it. We will prosecute anybody who violates the law, but we need to follow and find new ways to get people out of the system, and we could focus on those that do really need to be there, that aren't making the adjustments, that aren't learning the new tools that are needed to keep our community safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick.
And Father Trowbridge from the Newman Center.
Very good. Thank you for having me here this evening. I think that the fact that I'm standing here is a sign of the positive intention on the DeKalb Police Department's behalf to make sure that the movement within this program, within this Compass program, which I support, is one that seeks the whole good of the life of the family, of the individual, and of the community as well. We know that the immediate decisiveness to eliminate error is an interest within enforcement, but we know that we must move in a manner that looks to promote the overall health of the citizen and of the community on the same part. The family, we understand, is the basic fundamental unit of our social structure within a community, and whenever we can move in a direction which seeks to heal habitual legal disruption in union with the language of the family, that it is fruit-bearing for the health of our local community. To challenge the parent or guardian to enter into and engage their responsibility more fully, I saw as a component of necessity in this regard. Necessity in the sense that the parent doesn't always, within these types of situations, does not take full advantage of their position of authority within the home and as the primary educator of their child, to assist them with the means of formation, awareness, and education for a child who is in the crosshairs of the law by virtue of their disruptive activity, I think is a sobering moment for a parent. It could be a scary moment for a parent. It could be one where a parent kind of reacts in a manner of defensiveness for the sake of the well-being of their child or their family. And the reality of this program, which seeks to address the family, the individual, and the positive rapport between local law enforcement for the good of the individual and the family, I think is something that lessens the tension within a moment that could escalate in quite the level of anxiety. So with those words being spoken, I support Compass. Thank you.
That did not morph into one of your longer homilies.
I was going to joke.
Thank you. John, any other comments?
Well, in conclusion, Mayor, Council, Mr. Amato said it well, as did the others. We can't arrest our way out of everything. We have to come up with new ideas. We need to be innovative. And as we sat around that table, I remember that afternoon when we were challenged to try to figure something out, we discussed one juvenile in particular that was responsible for about 50 car burglaries. I mean, just a number. And that particular person had been in the system, and we thought, what could we have done earlier on in his life where we might have been able to divert him from that path. So we're very excited about the program. We appreciate the time that you gave us, and we feel it's a very worthy endeavor. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, John. We are running somewhat short on time. Kate, can you give us a
Be
short...
brief.
Yes.
Okay. I certainly applaud your efforts and the multi-pronged approach you're taking. I'm especially pleased as a parent seeing the component of the parental support, because I think parents together with your support, your education, can also provide each other with ideas that have worked. And sometimes breaking out of your own pattern of thinking and hearing alternatives can be just the spur that is needed. So again, thank you to all. Thank you to the supporters that you have, and I'll certainly wish and pray that it does begin to turn people's lives around.
Yeah, the collaborative nature of this is really impressive, and I thank you all for coming forward and endorsing this.
I'd like to note, Mayor, that there are a number of other partners involved in this, as well as other faith-based members that fully support, this endeavor, but weren't able to make it tonight.
Well, kudos to all of you. Alderman Fagan?
Yeah, I was just about to say the same thing. I mean, this is just impressive how everything was presented. It really was. And if we can get this up to vote for an ordinance, the sooner the better. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other comments? Any thing that was not on the committee of the whole agenda tonight that anybody would like to speak to? If not, I'd like to call for a motion to adjourn the committee of the whole.
So moved.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Any further discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Committee of the whole meeting is adjourned. We will reconvene as city council at 6:15.